Welcome back to Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. I'm Jack Llewellyn. As always, thanks for joining me. Today, we're going to take a look into the future of U.S. and Mexico relations based upon some thoughts about the U.S. election, which happened last Tuesday, and then things that have happened in the last week or so that shed light on some of the things that the forthcoming Trump administration may do and how that's going to interact with policies in Mexico and other agenda items for the Mexican government, and also how that's going to affect or might affect the cartels in Mexico. So we're going to try and walk through this in a little bit of a methodical way and perhaps shed light on some of these issues. I should note that there's been a lot of forecasting going on. And, within hours of Trump being declared the winner, you saw articles all over, how's this going to affect this situation or that, or what's going to happen. And I wanted to wait a little bit to at least see how things of the new administration were starting to develop. And I think we've got some good signs on that. So let's talk about border policies in general. And remember, President Scheinbaum has been in office for barely more than a month, right? A month and 11 days. And so the policies that her administration may implement, some probably have been implemented, but there's a lot still to come. And one of the things that we're starting to see, maybe just hints of, is where she's going to deviate from the policies of her predecessor, AMLO. And we've talked before about the idea that, and I think you can see this in the U.S. election. When President Scheinbaum is running, she's running for the Morena Party. She is AMLO's protege. Even if she disagrees with some of AMLO's policies, it's not easy for her in that position, and given how popular AMLO was, to expressly disavow or disagree with his policies. But perhaps if there are those disagreements or nuanced differences between the policies she wants to implement and what AMLO had, perhaps you see those coming out over time as she gets more and more comfortable in her position. Same thing, as I said, in the Harris election. Some of the post-election analysis have said that one of the things that may have hurt Harris's campaign was her inability or lack of willingness to distinguish her policies from those of President Biden. But you're also in a situation where President Biden had stepped aside, had basically anointed her the successor in the Democratic Party, et cetera, et cetera. So let's look at the border policies as I started a moment ago. Remember that from an economic standpoint, nearshoring is something very, very important to President Scheinbaum. And we had talked about in an episode not too long ago about how there's a concern that if you move all of or a large portion of the economic might of the country, at least outside of some major cities, into areas in the north, to kind of border areas, that leaves a huge vacuum economically in other portions of the country. Nevertheless, that's a clear policy that she's looking for. And that, I think, and it seems most people think, that policy is going to be directly impacted by some of the policies and events that are going to take place within the Trump administration, and probably fairly quickly. one of the things that we've seen, obviously, throughout the campaign is heavy-handed rhetoric from the Trump campaign. And even since the election, and we'll talk about this in a couple moments, talking about the greatest mass deportation in the history of the country, et cetera. So really what the question for Mexico is Trump going to be more radical, more aggressive in his approach to the border and to border policies than he was in his first administration? And so you hear discussions, and not necessarily from Trump himself, but from some of his allies and supporters and spokespeople, talking about, could there be, military action inside of Mexico? And I don't think a lot of people see what you might think of as an open invasion as highly plausible, but certainly you could see him authorizing covert operations, things of that nature. And remember, we just had the El Mayo situation, wasn't under Trump, but was another situation where there were operations apparently in Mexico without the knowledge of the Mexican government. And, that caused a rift with the Mexican government, one that's still there. If you've read my newsletter, the continuing back and forth of who was the pilot, who owned the plane that flew El Mayo to the United States. One of the things you can probably expect is the Trump administration will take a very, very hard line position initially, both to kind of test the will and resolve of the Scheinbaum administration, and also from a negotiating standpoint, right? You take the strongest position you can, and then if something needs to change and be modified, you're working back from a strong position to begin with. There was something published by Elon Musk, who apparently has become a key advisor. I read an article today that said he's barely left Mar-a-Lago since the election. One article called him the dinner guest that won't leave. But one of the things that he talked about was the idea that there could be terrorists or arrests of terrorists on the country's southern border, and that could lead to new actions. So the former ambassador to Mexico under the Trump administration, Christopher Landau, was quoted as saying, if there was a terrorist attack in the United States committed by someone who crossed the border from Mexico, that border will never return to normal. Keep in mind, when we say, never return to normal, the volume of goods, supplies, people, money, the economic waves that ebb and flow back and forth between Mexico and the United States is huge, and it's vitally important for both countries. So when we think about that, the reality is, and I started with this because I wanted to have the overview, but the specter of terrorism, the specter of illegal activity going across the border affects not only kind of security. Do you build a wall? How does Customs and Border Patrol change their policies or their actions? But it also affects discussions of the basic relationship between the United States and Mexico, that of trade and that of immigration or migration. So with that in mind, one of the things that has come up is the idea of, do we designate, or will the Trump administration designate cartels as a terrorist group or as terrorist groups. If you read some of the literature on this and delve into it from kind of in a deep level and not just on kind of the superficial, you find that security experts, foreign relations experts, have a little bit of disagreement back and forth on whether this is A, something that can be done, or B, something that should be done. Security specialists are often divided because narco violence does not fit nice and neat into the classical definition of terrorism. Terrorism is defined as the use of violence for political, ideological, or religious purposes. And the fact of the matter is that's not what cartels or organized crime really does. And there's a nice quote from an academic in Monterey who said, organized crime is interested in having the government in its pocket, but it does not have a project to take over the government, like the Taliban or guerrillas in Colombia. A security expert and analyst by the name of David Saucedo says car bombs and the like do not constitute acts of narco-terrorism because the aim is to obtain economic criminal benefit, to instill panic in the population, to spread the message to the media, to send a message to the authorities. He says there is no political vindication, but it can be said that drug trafficking generates situations equivalent to those carried out by terrorist groups and just as serious. Interestingly enough, the U.S. has statutes that allow for extraterritorial applications when it comes to combating terrorism. Now, I say interestingly enough because that legislation itself may not be entirely compatible with established international law. A academic at the Autonomous University of Coahuila, Victor Sanchez, says, in Mexico, whether or not a group is labeled as terrorist does not provide permission for any country from outside. I am very critical of the security policy of this government, but it is a national issue. Another country cannot be allowed to take unilateral measures, even if it is the most powerful. And that's one of the key components, right? From a governing standpoint, from a public perception standpoint, generally speaking, the Mexican people are going to be opposed to any foreign actors coming into the country, including and maybe especially the United States. So if you're President Scheinbaum, if you're in her administration, you're aware of that, allowing whether cartels are designated as terrorist organizations or not, allowing, and I put allowing in air quotes because that may be permitting or otherwise not acting in a sufficient way to keep it from happening, but allowing U.S. forces to come into Mexico, even if they're going after people like El Mencho or El Mayo or whoever. There's political ramifications to that. I went through a bunch of different articles and tried to come up with, 5 or 6 potential benefits and then potential drawbacks to having the cartels designated as terrorist organizations. So some of the drawbacks, the diplomatic strain. Such a designation could easily strain diplomatic relations between the United States and Mexico. Mexico, for the reasons just stated, might view this as an infringement on their sovereignty and an overstep into internal as opposed to external affairs. If that's the case, you could see decrease in cooperation in areas like drug enforcement, immigration, border security, etc. Impact on trade and economy could be another potential drawback. Designating the cartels as terrorist organizations could impact the trade relationship between the United States and Mexico by leading to stricter security of transactions, affecting businesses and economies on both sides of the border, as we just talked about. There could be legal and law enforcement complications. The designation would allow for more aggressive law enforcement actions against these groups, but that could also complicate legal proceedings, potentially leading to broader interpretations of what constitutes support or association with these cartels. And remember, if you're in a situation, so El Mayo, let's assume that it was all a U.S. operation. U.S. comes in, flies him out. You know, they had the help from Joaquin, but they get him out. Now he's going to be tried in the U.S., and any argument about being abducted, etc., isn't going to help him. What if there's a joint operation, or what if there's an operation, and then at some point the accused, the arrested, doesn't get flown as El Mayo did to the United States, but remains in Mexico? If that person is tried in Mexico, those defenses are going to be far more powerful. And remember, we've talked so many times about the push and the pull between prosecution and the judiciary in Mexico, and how many times traffickers or alleged traffickers are let off by the judiciary while their prosecution had been promoted by the government and pushed hard. Clearly, a designation of the cartels as terrorist organizations would have an impact on immigration. Individuals fleeing violence in Mexico could well be implicated or associated with these organizations, which could lead to complications in asylum proceedings, unjust treatment of immigrants and refugees. And that's a big issue already, right? And we're going to talk about that again in a moment. You could really see a potential escalation in violence if the cartels are named as terrorist organizations. The cartels might respond with increased aggression, both within Mexico or even potentially against U.S. interests. The fact is that if a cartel is designated as a terrorist organization, in theory, that gives law enforcement additional power, additional authority, additional ways to disrupt the financial networks of these organizations. But it would be very hard to separate those financial networks from legitimate businesses and legitimate business people who might be unknowingly connected or have been coerced into doing business, or who simply aren't aware that they're doing business. Remember all the different layers of the economic flow of money around the cartels and the number of quote-unquote legitimate businesses that are funded sometimes far down the road, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps removed from the cartels. And how do you deal with those people who aren't wrapped up? What's the economic effect going to be on them? And then the fact of the matter is, designating the cartels as terrorist organizations may not really do anything. The demand in the U.S. isn't dropping significantly. Fentanyl use and fentanyl deaths apparently are down a little bit, but the overall demand for drugs in the United States remains strong, and I think is going to remain strong. And designate them as terrorist organizations if you want, but as long as there's demand, there's going to be the supply. I've said that 1,000 times on this podcast. There are also questions that we've talked about a lot of, all right, let's say for whatever reason, the United States says CJNG and CDS are terrorist organizations, and we're going to take covert actions in Mexico, and they're immediately, wonderfully successful. So you could envision a scenario where months or years down the road, CJNG is a shadow of its former self. CDS is a shadow of its former self. Does that change anything? Or does it simply mean that there are new cartels, new drug lords, new traffickers that replace the old ones and continue to supply the demand in the United States? I hearken back to our discussions about El Chapo. El Chapo goes down. What has happened? How did that affect the trade of drugs from Mexico into the United States? How has the arrest of El Mayo changed anything? Doesn't mean you don't take action. It just means that the end result may not be what you think it's going to be. There are a couple of potential benefits, of course, from designating them as terrorist organizations. Military assets can be used more freely in actions against terrorist organizations. Special forces can be deployed under both U.S. and international law, and we don't even want to get into the international law discussion, but just remember there are some distinctions between U.S. law and international law. In theory, a designation of the cartels as terrorist organizations would allow for advanced surveillance and increased sharing of intelligence within the American military and intelligence communities. We've talked at length about the interdepartment, interagency rivalries that appear to have not had positive impacts on the efforts in Mexico over time. But would those be any different if there was the terrorist designation? In theory, they should be, because of that designation and because of some of the mechanics of it. And then lastly, there are additional financial and legal measures that can be taken against terrorist organizations that simply are not available to law enforcement for those people and entities not so designated. I want to talk also about the idea of the border crossings and mass deportations. We'll talk about these in a couple of different ways. So, one of the suggestions that has been raised at various times in order to combat both illegal immigration and the drug trafficking into the United States, and in theory, the trade of weapons and money and other things from the United States into Mexico. But one of the things that could be done is to have border closings. We can hearken all the way back to the Camarena case, when the real break in the case came, unfortunately, which resulted in finding Agent Camarena and Captain Zavala's bodies, but came as a result of the border being closed. From a practical standpoint, given the amount of traffic, the amount of economic weight behind that traffic, and the flow of goods and commerce from one country to the other, border closing seems to be a difficult thing to swallow. One of the things that we've learned in the last week since the election is that the policy on immigration And the idea of mass deportations of undocumented migrants in the United States is going to be harsh, it's going to be severe, and it's going to match the rhetoric of the campaign. How do we know that? Well, one of the things we can do is we can look at who already has been named to lead that charge in the new administration. So Stephen Miller has been named, designated to be the deputy chief of staff, and he will likely be in charge of or highly involved in mass deportations and the paring back of both undocumented and legal immigration. He was heavily involved in Trump's first administration. He is responsible or wasn't responsible for some of the strictest immigration policies. His rhetoric, agree with it or disagree with it, is very, very strident, very right-wing, in political terms. And so we know he's going to be involved. We also know that Thomas Homan, who was the acting director of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, in the first administration, is going to be involved and be now kind of the immigration czar. If you remember, he was one who supported and enacted and put into place President Trump's policy during his first administration of separating undocumented families who had been detained at the border. In July, Homan said, quote, "I will run the biggest deportation force this country has ever seen." So we have a pretty good idea, right, of what's going to happen and how those things are going to occur. Here's a couple of other nuances to think about. There's going to be political pressure on politicians in Mexico, probably in ways they've never felt before. So we can go, back 2, 4, 6 administrations, and we can talk about the ebb and flow of the war on drugs, the relationship between the United States and Mexico, between the presidents of the two countries. I think it's probably fair to say that the Scheinbaum administration will face pressure from the Trump administration in ways no other Mexican administration has felt with respect to the war on drugs, save and except for a certain period around the Kiki Camarena kidnapping and murder. I also think it's interesting to note that there will be a new U.S. ambassador to Mexico. Ken Salazar, whom I've mentioned before, I used to work for, who's from Colorado, has been the ambassador to Mexico for several years. In my understanding, his relationship in Mexico is very good. His heritage, his background supports kind of a closer relationship with the Mexican people and his Mexican contemporaries and colleagues than maybe some others will have. It'll be interesting to see what the effect there is as well. And then remember, President Scheinbaum is going through several things right now as well. And we've talked about that. How are things going to change? One of the things that I found very interesting was an article that came out just a couple of days ago from the Associated Press. And I just want to read a little bit of this to you because it shows, remember when I started off saying, sometimes politicians say one thing when they're in office or when they're running for office and then slightly morph afterwards. That may particularly be true with President Scheinbaum Again, because she was so much wrapped up in AMLO. AMLO was still president. AMLO did press conferences once a day. She was his protege. She ran with his party and his blessing. She really wasn't in a position to say, hey, I really disagree with X, Y, or Z. But how is that going to change, if at all, during her administration? So here's what the Associated Press article had to say. For the last 6 years, Mexico bragged about its oft-questioned hugs, not bullets strategy, in which leaders avoided confrontations with drug cartels that were gradually taking control of large parts of the country. The thinking was that social programs, not shootouts, would gradually drain the pool of cartel gunmen. Now, a month into the term of new President Claudia Scheinbaum, a string of bloody confrontations suggests the government is quietly abandoning the no bullets part of the strategy and is much more willing to use the full force of the military and the militarized National Guard. But the challenge Mexico now faces is different from that during the country's 2006 to 2012 drug war. Cartels today are more diversified, more deeply entrenched in migrant smuggling, and more willing to use foreign recruits and adolescents to fill their ranks. All of that has led to a string of violent clashes, in which security forces who shoot at suspected drug cartel convoys wind up killing bystanders and migrants, and reporting lopsided death tolls in which soldiers aren't harmed, but most of the suspects are wiped out. Scheinbaum has studiously avoided using the hugs, not bullets slogan popularized by her predecessor and mentor, former President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, who left office on September 30th. She has, after all, pledged to continue each and every one of Lopez Obrador's policies. Her office did not respond to a request for comment. But Scheinbaum has had to perform some verbal gymnastics to avoid disowning. Okay, one more time. Sorry. But Scheinbaum has had to perform some verbal gymnastics to avoid disowning the policy entirely. Clearly, this isn't a question of hugs for criminals. Nobody has ever said that. Scheinbaum said shortly after taking office, the hugs, she said, were meant for impoverished youth to avoid having them recruited as cartel gunmen. There are traces of change in tone toward organized crime, but it's too early to call, said Falco Ernst, a security analyst. It seems unlikely that Scheinbaum and its administration would risk a potentially inconvenient, steady stream of violent imagery by betting on wholesale bullets-only strategy. But there may be more willingness to confront the most overt and brazen displays of power by the cartels. There's a few other paragraphs here, but I'll leave it at that. But think about that. So if Mexico's policy is changing, even if in the nuances and ever so slightly, how is that going to impact the relationship with the Trump administration starting in January? And when we look at the news over the next week or two or three or four and see what's been going on, even if we look back to some of the higher profile raids that have occurred and arrests that have occurred in the last few months, is there a change in policy that might allow for a more equal debate or negotiation between the two countries? That is, can the Scheinbaum government say, look, here's everything we're doing. Here are the results. And therefore, you, President Trump, you, United States, don't need to designate the cartels as foreign terrorists. You don't need to engage in covert operations in Mexico. You don't need to take actions that require the government to stand up for their own sovereignty. Those I think, are significant issues. And then the last one that I didn't mention a moment ago is, just think about this. If there's the largest deportation in American history, you're going to have a whole lot of people, right, being sent back into Mexico. I'm not really sure how the logistics of that work, but let's say that happens. Are you essentially providing a populace that by definition is going to be impoverished, displaced, disorganized? Are they prime candidates for working for the cartels? And in that regard, are you actually facilitating the cartel recruitment process by engaging in the deportation process? All right, that's a few hypotheticals, a few questions to end the day. I hope that was helpful. I mean, I find I've said this before on these podcasts. I said this to a good friend of mine the other day, and I said, if you put aside the human cost, the cartel structure, the cartel systems, and how they ebb and flow and how leadership changes, I think are fascinating. And they're fascinating not in a morbid way, but that we can learn things, that we can understand these organizations better and then know better how to confront them, or how to shape public policy in ways that actually have positive impacts. It's easy to shape policy that changes things, that may disrupt the status quo. But if you don't end up with a positive impact, who cares? It's only by studying these organizations that you can really do that. I think this is a fascinating process that could really have long-term positive impacts, but it requires deep and sophisticated study and thought. And there are some, there's some very good academics that do that. We've talked about people at the Brookings Institute and some other places. There's some really good journalists. Ewan Grillo, does an amazing job. And I think it's worth continuing to look at and talk about and understand for this administration, for the next one, for policies in your local jurisdictions, in different states, etc. So I'll leave it there. Next week, I believe we're going to have a special guest who has written a fascinating book that I'll tell you more about when he is here. And that is it. I will see you next week on Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. Have a great week, everyone.